It's the reason we have to prevent this kind of abuse, because once it happens, it doesn't leave you. It doesn't let up. And you can get therapy, and you should get, all kinds of support and whatever works for you, but it doesn't erase what happened. And that's why it's the worst crime, because childhood sexual abuse is a toxic, devastating thing. And she coped by creating her own family. There are various ways that people cope. She loved animals. She loved music. She wasn't not trying to heal. She was trying to heal. But those wounds are deep and they do not fully heal. And it's just a travesty that she didn't make it to see this book not just born into the world, but embraced by so many.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. Today, our guest is Amy Wallace, the ghostwriter for Virginia Giuffre's memoir, Nobody's Girl. Virginia Giuffre was an American advocate and survivor of sex trafficking who became widely known for accusing financier Jeffrey Epstein and his associates, including Prince Andrew, of sexual abuse. She died by suicide in April 2025 at her home in Australia. At the time of her death, her book, Nobody's Girl, had been finished and was slated for publication. As you will hear us discuss, Amy needed to come forward at that time to provide a bridge to the manuscript in light of public details about Virginia that came to light just before her death, namely the abusive nature of her marriage, which had not been detailed in the book itself. Amy Wallace splits her time between books and magazines. Her magazine work has appeared in GQ, Wired, The New Yorker, Esquire, Vanity Fair, Details, The Nation, The New York Times Magazine, Elle, and others. She has collaborated on two other books besides Nobody's Girl, 2021's Hot Seat by Jeff Immelt, the former CEO of General Electric, and also 2014's Creativity Inc. with Ed Catmull, who was the former president of Pixar and Disney Animation. Today's show has a lot of discussion of suicide. If you are thinking of harming yourself, please call 988. Someone is waiting for your call. Amy Wallace, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just start by talking about what being a collaborating author means. I know this isn't your first collaboration. Can you just talk about that process and specifically what it was like collaborating with Virginia Giuffre?
Yeah. So ghostwriting, I think there are a lot of misconceptions, or people just don't really know how it works. Basically, you team up with somebody who wants to write a book, and initially you interview them a lot about their story, but also what they're hoping to communicate. I think the part that isn't as well known is that a good ghostwriter really corroborates the story or fleshes it out more broadly. The two previous books I'd done before working with Virginia were people who'd run companies, and they had leadership lessons that you wanted to communicate. And my job was in large part sort of finding the anecdotes and the stories that would illustrate the leadership lessons. Obviously, Virginia's story was much more of a chronological narrative about her life, but in similar ways, although with a different kind of topic, we had to make sure everything was accurate. And that's always true in a book, but with her, the stakes were very high. She had already taken on some of the most powerful, wealthy men in the world and accused them of things that they had denied, and some of them threatened her in response. So we knew while I'm always trying to be as accurate as possible, we knew the stakes for her were both litigation potential if we made errors and also physical danger. She'd been threatened. So my job was both personal and talking often on Zoom like this with her and getting her story straight, but then also investigative and making sure we had it right.
You mentioned in the preface that you also worked with a professional fact checker. Mm-hmm. And had you done that with the previous two books, or was that something that you did just with her?
Well, I've worked with professional fact checkers throughout my life. When I was a magazine writer full-time, you get fact checked, and it's always it's always helpful. I don't think we hired fact checkers on the other two books only because, well, I'm not sure exactly why. It is in the realm of these projects, the writer hires the fact checker, the publisher does not. And so the writer decides whether that's an expense they want to take on. We had a great fact checker, but the project went on longer. I mean, usually these projects take 2 to 3 years, and we worked on this for almost 5. And so by the time we were finishing and had a couple of more corroborating conversations to have, that fact checker had already had to move on and had fulfilled his contract. So I ended up doing a lot of those final fact checks. But yeah, we had a great team working on making this book as good as it could be.
So something that's kind of implied, and so you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but as I was reading through the book, she, as you just pointed out, she'd already testified. She'd already gone on the record. And it seems through no intent, she had maybe made some mistakes that you guys were able to kind of correct about how old she was at certain times, things like that.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about what that process was like in terms of finding out that something that she'd said on the record may not have been accurate.
Yeah, there were two. The first one that you mentioned, it's important to put it in context. So there's a point where she thinks, and she describes all this in the book, she thinks that they are actually going to prosecute Epstein, and she's excited about that. And she has not come out of the shadows at that point. She's just one of the many survivors. And the lawyers come back to her and they say, oh, no, no, no. No one's going to prosecute him. The only thing you can do is sue him for money civilly. And she's like, well, that's not what I want. I want him to be prosecuted. But they explain. And then they say, well, let's file a Jane Doe suit, trying to look for money, because that's all you're going to get. That's the only way you're going to punish him. So from memory, she tells a story, and she says she was 15 when she met him, when she was actually 16. And that has been, by the time I started working on the book, that had already been litigated, and Ghislaine Maxwell's lawyers had said, see, she's a big fat liar. And, they tried to make a big deal out of that. But again, you have to remember that she was a teenage sex trafficking survivor. And before she had met Epstein and Maxwell, she had also been trafficked previously and raped in her own home, sexually abused as a child from the ages of 7 to 11. So she didn't have an Excel chart of what age she was at, but she was going from memory. So later, lawyers would establish when she worked at Mar-a-Lago, which is where she was procured, and they would help her fill in those details. But she was a child victim, and she did not write all the dates and times down. And she would often say to me, I don't remember, we need to double check dates and times, but I remember what happened. I remember who it happened to. The second example of a previous error that had, again, already been described before I came onto the project was that she was encouraged after she first came forward publicly in 2011 by a tabloid journalist to write her own memoir. And she attempted to do that. And it's something that people can go and read. It's available publicly in the court record. But the tabloid journalist said, as a way of protecting yourself from litigation is to change some of the details. So she followed that completely incorrect advice. And she changed one of the locations of a time when she was trafficked to Prince Andrew. And she changed some other details. That doesn't matter when. And so we had to explain that in the book as well, that she was misinformed, that she thought she was protecting herself. She wasn't. That wasn't going to protect her of anything. And that she changed a couple of details in order to hopefully protect herself. So
I want to bounce back to that first one because the whole idea that Ghislaine Maxwell is going to dwell on the fact that she was actually 16 when she was 15, that is really relevant to the law that we're trying to change in Alaska, to move our age of consent to 18, currently at 16. But it's not really relevant in Florida. Florida has an age of consent of 18. So whether she was 15 or 16, the crime was the crime.
Ab-
So, yeah.
Absolutely. I think Ghislaine is just trying to use it to say, see, she's a liar. And so you can't believe anything she says.
Right. Although I will quote from the book, Jeffrey Epstein really dwelled on the fact that, I'm going to quote, that different nations and states define the age of consent differently. In Florida, it's 18. In New York, it's 17. In England, it's 16. It gave him ammunition. He said these inconsistencies prove these laws were arbitrary and meaningless. No one could convince him that sex with minors was wrong because no one could agree on what a minor was.
Yes, I was thinking of that passage when I got ready to get on this call with you. I think an important thing to say there is that, Jeffrey was an incredibly intelligent and manipulative person, and he found many ways to validate his own predation. The other thing that he said, and it's in the book, is that basically he required that any girl that he raped had their period. They could be 11 years old, but if they had their period, then biologically they were women, and therefore they were there to have sex with him. And that was perfectly legitimate. And again, it's a validation. It's a way of validating his own perversion. But he was smart, and he could say, look, it's different everywhere. So none of those laws have meaning. And obviously I disagree with that, but that's just the way government works in the United States, is that states can have their own laws and pass their own age requirements for consent.
Yeah, there's some shocking quotes from Jeffrey Epstein about, the ways that he justified the crimes that he committed. I just, again, flipping to the end of the book, she says, don't be fooled by those in Epstein's circle who say they didn't know what Epstein was doing. Anyone who spent any significant amount of time with Epstein saw him touching girls in ways you wouldn't want a creepy old man touching your daughter. And I think that was very clear, a uniting thread throughout the book, that Epstein almost bragged about his behavior. And I think she even said at one point that he wanted everyone to know what he was doing. He just didn't want to be punished for it.
It was a very arrogant, and again, I think people maybe assume, because they would, if it were them, they would do this, that he had this predilection for children, and that he did that in secret, because who would do it out in the open? That's not the case. If you went to a dinner at his house, very often there were girls around the table. They were not asked to speak, but they were like a garnish. They were on display. And he traveled with young girls. He was sort of thumbing his nose at the rules, like they didn't apply to him. And so it was completely out in the open. And people would notice it, but then turn their heads and not do anything about it. I think what that also communicates is a real denigration of, these girls clearly signed up for this. If they wanted to leave, they could. And so sort of damning the victim.
I spoke with the director of the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault yesterday. She viewed this book as really changing her life, really. Like, she felt that, as somebody who worked in this arena for many, many years, decades actually, that it really helped her connect the dots between domestic violence, sexual assault, and sex trafficking. And an epiphany for me, when I think of sex trafficking, the way it's been presented to me is that it's often folks who are kind of locked in an apartment, someone who's been trafficked from another country, their passport's been confiscated, they're being held prisoner. And Ghislaine Maxwell, in her first deposition, as it's recounted in the book, talked about Virginia Giuffre was not a prisoner. She wasn't handcuffed. She was going home to her own apartment. And I think the book does a really good job of painting the picture that, yeah, she was going home to her own apartment. She had a boyfriend, but she felt compelled to continually show up at the date and time specific to answer these phone calls. Even years later, she talked about being in Thailand, where she was planning her escape, of staying in the hotel room for days waiting for Ghislaine Maxwell to call so she would not miss that phone call. So I
Yeah.
don't know if you can talk a little bit about that, about, how it might appear to folks on the outside that she was doing this of her own free will, but that coercion and manipulation that was really controlling her behavior was present.
Yeah, I mean, coercion is as I understand it, one of the main ingredients to trafficking, and it can come in many forms. In Virginia's case, remember, 2 or so weeks after meeting Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, being procured by Ghislaine Maxwell, and that very day being raped by both of them. But she continues to come back. Why? Early on, at 2 weeks in, Jeffrey Epstein puts a photograph down on his desk of her little brother, Sky, who is then maybe 12. And it's clearly a picture that has been taken of him at his school with his little backpack on his body. And, the photo communicates, we know you have a brother. We know what he looks like. We know where he goes to school. And we've taken his picture. And then Epstein says, you cross us, he's going to pay for it. Some version of those words. So that is coercion. That is threat. And I think she does a really good job of describing both the threats and the carrot and the stick. The carrot was, we see something in you. And for a lot of these very young girls, they hadn't been told that enough in their lives. They had been told they were worthless in various ways. So there was this double-pronged manipulation, which is part of trafficking, which is grooming the girl to feel somehow valuable and also abusing them at the same time, and also threatening them that if they don't continue to show up, they will pay the price in some way. So yeah, I think it is a common confusion about what trafficking is. Adults can be trafficked, and they don't have to be chained to radiators in a seedy hotel room to be trafficking victims. They can be held hostage in a lot of ways.
Well, first and foremost, pointing out that Ghislaine Maxwell participated in the abuse. And I think that is a common misconception, that she was like a recruiter, a scout for him, but she was extraordinarily active in the abuse. And I mean, there are details about things that she did to the girls different than Jeffrey Epstein that were painful, horrific. Um,
Yeah.
And I just think that's important to note when there's talk about her getting some sort of pardon, when there's talk about her with President Trump saying she's been treated very badly. She was not an observer. She was an active participant from the beginning.
Absolutely. And she inflicted pain on the girls herself during sexual situations. It has been fascinating to me how this is a woman who's been convicted of sex trafficking and of predation on girls. And somehow in the public understanding, some people still think she was just a receptionist who was booking the massages and getting out of the way. And sometimes that was true, but she was involved a lot of times as well, and directly involved in the abuse of the girls and young women. And again, I think the other element that is obvious, but just to state it again, is that none of these girls who Ghislaine recruited would have gone with Jeffrey Epstein. If Jeffrey Epstein had approached them at wherever they were and said, hey, would you like to come give me a massage? They would not have gone because he was a creepy old man and they were teens. But she was a beautiful, posh, British accent, carrying an expensive handbag, seemed very reputable. And she was vouching for the safety. I will be there with you. You won't be alone with this strange man that you've never even met. I will be there with you. Little do they know that when the door closes behind them, yes, she's there and she's participating in the sexual abuse. So it has been fascinating to me to watch sort of the public perception shift. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's based in this idea, which is reprehensible, that the only person who's been punished in the United States of America for Epstein's crimes is a woman. That is a great irony. As it happens, she's a woman who deserved to be punished. But there are a lot of men who these girls were trafficked to, who are walking around free, haven't even been investigated, haven't even been interviewed by the FBI, even though many survivors have come forward and named their names in sworn depositions. So that is a problem. I agree with that, that only a woman is being punished for this series of crimes, heinous crimes. But as it happens, that doesn't make this woman innocent of the crimes.
Well, Jeffrey Epstein was in jail when he committed suicide. I mean, like, he was behind bars. So in spite of his very best efforts, I think the writing was on the wall for him that he was never coming out.
Yes.
And so that did happen. But I do want to talk about naming names. I cannot even imagine the stress of writing a book where, you're talking about Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew is front and center in this memoir. I think it's 3 times that she met with him.
Yeah.
That she was trafficked to him. And each of those episodes is detailed. What I found interesting, and then Jean-Luc Brunel is prominent. What's interesting to me is that throughout the book, it says a former governor of a Western state. But then at the end of the book, it is former Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico. And so I don't know if you can talk about the names that you're willing to name and the decisions behind that. And I guess specifically because Bill Richardson is named so late in the book, but is kind of referred to throughout the first 2/3 of the book without a name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. And for those who are interested in the book, she talks about her decision-making process about who to name and who not to name in the book, I think pretty articulately. But to summarize it, she had bravely talked to the FBI twice. She had also given several sworn depositions in various cases, many of which are public. And in those depositions, she named who she'd been trafficked to. Not every name, but many of the names. So then she is writing a memoir, and she needs to decide a couple of things. Her physical safety is always, and that of her 3 children was paramount to her, but also her safety from litigation that would drag on for the rest of her life. And by that, I mean, she had been threatened specifically by one man in particular, who she had named publicly, basically saying, take our names out of your mouth, or we will keep you in court for the rest of your life. And these are very, very wealthy men who can afford to just continue asking for...
And forever.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, did you once have a bladder infection when you were 17? We need those records. So we can't finish. Oh, now we need... Just to drag it out, just to continue, it's another form of harassment. Of course, it's perfectly legal, because if you're involved in a lawsuit and you have to answer all those things, but it's a way of intimidating. It's a way of ruining a person's life. And she had been explicitly threatened with that. So as we're writing the book, I mean, on the one hand, she wanted to name all of them. I mean, she wanted to hold them accountable. On the other hand, we had real, almost philosophical conversations about what the purpose of this book was. She had named those men in public previously. This book wasn't designed to be a list of men. It was designed to take you into the world of a young girl and then a young woman who is dealing with multiple traumas, and to help other victims of sexual abuse, male and female, not just Epstein and Maxwell survivors, anyone who's been abused and coerced into sex, to help those people feel less alone, help them feel less shame, help them perhaps heal. That was her biggest goal. And so it came down to, in the end, was it worth renaming these men who had been named publicly and had publicly said, she's a liar? Or would we just tell what it felt like to be in this situation, which we all agreed was going to have almost more impact than a list of names? Furthermore, the list of names is in the Epstein files. And by the time that, the book comes out, or even before, when the last time I went to Australia and read her the final manuscript, and we made some final edits, President Trump was already campaigning on releasing the Epstein files. So Virginia believed that he was going to make good on his promise and that work was going to be done by releasing the Epstein files. She knew who she had named to the FBI in 2 separate interviews. And she knew that other survivor sisters, as they call each other, had named names. So that was supposed to happen. Trump was campaigning on it. Come on, because MAGA cared about pedophiles. And that he wanted that base to show up. So when it served him to campaign on the basis of releasing, he did. Then he won, not only for that reason, but partly. And then he stepped back and said, we're not doing that. And only because survivors kept the pressure on, a couple of key Republican legislators added their voices, women, to the call for the Epstein files. Do we finally get a partial release? They still haven't followed the law in numerous ways.
Complaints are that the version of the Epstein files that has been released, the names of the victims were not redacted, but the names of the rich and powerful men were redacted. It just seems like it is a setup for those victims to be harassed and for those wealthy and powerful men to remain safe.
It's astounding. That's exactly what it is. I could go on and on about the mishandling of the release, that they were required by law to redact the names of the girls and women. They didn't. And the search function, if you go in and try to play around with it, searching for names, I've followed several different survivors' experiences. They're not supposed to be able to find their name at all. One survivor types her name in, she gets 6 hits. She calls them up. They're not supposed to be there, but they're there. Her telephone number, her address. But then as she starts going through the files, she starts finding other documents that have her name in them. So the search function doesn't work, by the way. And then, as you point out, the men and women, there are some co-conspirator women, those names are redacted. That was not part of the law. That was not supposed to be how it worked. So not everyone is redacted, but a lot of them are. And you just start to go, what is this? And then beyond that, only half of the documents have been released. They're supposed to release all the documents. So the number of, it's not even mishandling, they are illegal things that are happening. They are not following the letter of the law that was just passed. So it's hard to even know how to communicate how outrageous this is. They are not following the law that our elected officials just passed. And they are doing it fairly flagrantly. And now saying, kind of nothing to see here, we're done. So it's astounding.
I want to ask about the preface where you name your name. I assume that had Virginia Giuffre not died by suicide in 2025, that the book would have appeared without your name. Is that correct?
Yes, I was supposed to be a completely invisible ghostwriter. And that was what I signed up for and what I looked forward to.
Did you have to think about whether or not to come out with your own name? Because I'm just thinking, like, there are names named in this book, and she's gone, and you're putting your name on the book now. I mean, did you have any pause? And have you yourself received any harassment because of your association with the book?
I didn't pause. What happened was we'd finished the book. She had told me explicitly in writing, she'd written me and her publicist an email saying, in the case of my passing, I want the book published. So we knew her desire was there, and we had a finished, approved manuscript. We had a finished, approved cover. We had all the elements. But in the interim, not only had she died, but she had made allegations against her husband from whom she was separated that were public, that ran in People magazine. And we felt like we needed to fill in that gap to help. Readers were going to say, like, wait a minute, there's a book coming out. I thought she had died. And somebody needed to step forward and say, here's the situation. Here's how this came to pass. And so the publisher asked me to do that, and I understood the reasons why they wanted me to do that. And, at that point, it had been 5 years that I'd been working with Virginia, And I believed wholeheartedly in the importance of her story. And I wanted it published too, so I was happy to step forward and try to bridge the gap for readers and put the book in context. But of course, yeah, my husband and I had conversations about what that was going to mean. This is a very high profile story. We didn't know how incredibly well it would be received, but once it got published, regardless of how many people bought the book, it was going to be out there. And what that was going to mean for me, physical safety wise, and what that was going to mean for me in terms of being open to sort of attack. I got to say, I've been very, very careful, and tried to be very self-aware, but no one has really, other than some Twitter or X trolling, I haven't really faced anything at this point that I couldn't handle. But partly, in that first round of interviews that, I helped launch the book when it came out last October, I was very explicit. I mean, I said, do not break into my house. I said into the camera on Piers Morgan and other various interviews I was asked to do, don't break into my house. My tapes are not here. My notes are not here. The manuscript is not here. It is elsewhere. And I was aware that those assets had value for some people. I have Virginia on tape naming people who hurt her. So I was explicit about that as a form of self-defense. So, I mean, it's been frankly an honor to have the opportunity to speak up for her, not to speak for her, but to speak up for her. She deserves that. She was such a brave and determined person. And she did these things for us, for all of us. They took a toll on her. But she didn't want her kids to grow up in a world that was so awful and so purely misogynistic towards girls and young women and old women for that matter. And she just decided, I have to do something. And I find that incredibly inspiring. Remember, this is a girl who didn't graduate from high school, who didn't have any money for most of her life. And she just decided. I mean, and I find that incredibly, we should all be more like that. I mean, when I got the email from you, you're standing up and saying the age of consent in Alaska ought to be higher. We have a problem here, you all. And it takes stepping forward and doing things that people are going to criticize you for. But we all have to do that in order to make change.
Hey, Amy, and I'll just say it is shocking to me how difficult it is to raise the age of consent in Alaska. It seems like a no-brainer. And to most people, they say, who opposes this? Powerful men oppose this.
Yep.
And it is shocking. But hey, I want to talk about people speaking out. You mentioned the photograph of Sky when he was young as being used to basically blackmail her. Hey,
Yeah.
we know what's important to you, your younger brother. He's on every show now. And he testified yesterday. So we're recording today on April 29th. April 28th, he appeared in front of Congress testifying for his sister. And I don't know, you obviously fact-checked lots of things with him. You spoke with him a lot. Did he know that he was going to be the voice for his sister? And I mean, can you talk a little bit about his role today? Because it's just so front and center.
Yeah. I mean, so Sky is 5 years younger than Virginia, was her beloved little brother. She also has an older brother who she loved out of her mind as well. But Sky, she's 5 years old and he was born and his crib was in her room and she adored him. And he and his wife, Amanda, who's amazing and incredibly articulate herself, have really stepped forward. Her older brother and his wife have also stepped forward, but Sky and Amanda have been, as you say, front and center. And they're amazing. And did they know? No, they didn't know. Sky was in Australia with Virginia when she died. He really not only has lost her, but was with her in the days before she died. And so the loss for that family is immeasurable. And the way the two of them, particularly Sky and Amanda, but also Danny and Lynette, have stepped forward has been, again, incredibly moving. And I hope you don't edit out your emotional response because it's appropriate. They have taken their grief and they have turned it into activism. And Sky and Amanda both often break down in the middle of interviews. And that is the appropriate response. Their family member who really fought so hard for so many people is gone. And they are trying to not let her be forgotten, obviously, but also to carry on what she wanted to try to accomplish. She wanted to do away with statutes of limitations for childhood sexual abuse. You should not have a 10-year ticking clock if you've been abused at the age of 7. Or, fill in the blank. Every state has a different one. It's ridiculous. There should not be any statutes of limitations. That was very important to Virginia. And they've introduced legislation, Virginia's law in DC, to try to start with federal, and they're going to go state to state after that. So they too are heroes. And obviously they didn't know that Virginia was going to die. And they didn't, I don't think, know the scope of the reaction to the book. None of us knew how the book was going to be received. And man, they have stepped forward into the tornado, and admirably so, very admirably so.
In the preface, you actually printed the last correspondence you received from Virginia. It's strongly implied that she may be about to take her own life. I think it's clear in the preface that you were worried about that and that you were doing you encouraged her to go back to the hospital, that you did your best. But I guess, can you speak about that at all?
Yeah, well, to clear one thing up, because a lot of people have made that connection that you just made, and it's slightly in error, but that's on us and not on you. The reason she sent me and her publicist, Deanie, the email saying, in the case of my death, I want the book published, was not the context in which we understood that email at the time was not, oh my God, she might be about to do something to herself. But the fact that she had been in this bus accident, the bus had hit her car, and she had gone to the hospital, and then she'd posted on Instagram, she thought privately, but it had been public, a photo of herself very bruised in the hospital. And she said in that Instagram post, I only have 4 days to live. And in the wake of that, she sent the email. So we were more worried about injuries she sustained in the bus accident. And also, it seemed that some of the injuries were injuries she sustained in January when she had had an altercation with her husband, Robbie, and that they were lingering physical problems that were serious. So that email was not, hey, just by the way, in the case of I die. It was in the context of this ongoing health problem that she had. And as we describe in the book, she'd broken her neck. She was still dealing with surgery that had tried to repair that. And she had a lot of physical problems, as well as mental health problems that she describes in the book that are the natural outgrowth of trauma. And that, as you know, it's in the book, she had tried to kill herself previously while we had been working on the book. But when she sent that email, I didn't interpret it in terms of a possible cry for help or suicide. It was about these other health problems. But as you say, it was a constant conversation. I mean, she talked about it with several of us a lot, that there was this voice in her head, and she describes the voice in the book that says, you are worthless and the world would be a better place without you in it. And that is the natural outgrowth of being abused as a child and being forced to do things, inappropriate things, with people you thought you trusted, often. And the damage that does to your self-esteem. I mean, it doesn't go away. And so, we were we were all concerned about her all the time in terms of wanting to support her in any way we could and trying to get her help. But it's the reason we have to prevent this kind of abuse, because once it happens, it doesn't leave you. It doesn't let up. And you can get therapy, and you should get, all kinds of support and whatever works for you, but it doesn't erase what happened. And that's why it's the worst crime, because childhood sexual abuse is a toxic, devastating thing. And she coped by creating her own family. There are various ways that people cope. She loved animals. She loved music. She wasn't not trying to heal. She was trying to heal. But those wounds are deep and they do not fully heal. And it's just a travesty that she didn't make it to see this book not just born into the world, but embraced by so many.
One of the points in the preface is the revelations of abuse within her marriage to Robbie. And in the same way that that you pointed out that I'm reading this last email as a suicide note, when in the context of the time that was not the case, I think reading the whole book with the context that the marriage was abusive causes readers to look for red flags, and they are there. Her meeting him in Thailand, this mixed martial art fighter who's 7 years older than her, and basically agreeing to marry him after knowing him for a week, that's a red flag. And I'm just curious, when you went and met with her and read through the whole book in Australia, I mean, were there any details about Robbie that were added after that? Or was this, what we're reading today, is exactly what Virginia Giuffre knew was going to come in there? Because, like I said, they're just present. There's no explicit abuse ever mentioned in their relationship, but there's drugs and alcohol. She talks about difficult times.
She talks about his temper.
Yes.
Yeah. There are several places to go from there, but let me just say, so we locked the manuscript in the fall of 2024, right before the presidential election in the United States. And that's the book that people are reading. Now, in part, that's because we couldn't change any of it after she died. It's her book. I can't put words in her mouth. So we had this document, and it was as she had wanted it. As I explain in the preface, she had told me about an incident of domestic violence in 2015 when the family was living in Colorado, and they had three small children. It was a very stressful time. And I talked to both Virginia and Robbie about that when I was in Australia. And basically both of them had talked about really working hard to get past it. And that's the context within which Virginia put it to me and said, I think I want to leave that out because for our kids, they were little, they may not have known what was going on, and we're past it. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that was the gist of it. So we locked the book in the fall of 2024. And then in January 2025, she calls me and she says, Robbie just beat me up again. And I make sure that she's in a safe place. I call her family. I call her brothers. I try to call her mom. And basically, the goal there is just to make sure she's safe. But in the months after that, before she died, she went now with that. And that, as I said, I think I mentioned, there was a piece in People magazine. There were, so now the 2015 incident, which I already knew about, was public. And the January 2025 incident was public. And so that was part of the need for me to fill that in that preface. So also in the preface, we note that victims of sexual abuse as children are often predisposed to be in domestic violence situations. And again, that gets back to what we were talking about before, which is self-esteem and, what you think you deserve as a person. And you've been told you don't deserve much when you were a kid. So that follows you. That said, I think that's third section of the book where they meet and Robbie helps her escape. There is no question that Robbie helped her escape. And yes, they got married after a week, which is too soon. um, and it's probably too soon to get married when you're 19. But she was also in desperate straits. She had nowhere to go. And this man who she immediately cared for and seemed to care for her back said, you don't have to live that way. And so I do think one thing that Amanda, her sister-in-law, has said in interviews is, two things can be true at the same time. And that I think they did fall in love with each other and they did escape together. And it is because of that that we, you know, that she was able to heal enough to start taking on perpetrators. And also the fact that with Robbie, she formed a family, which I think is for a lot of abuse survivors, something that they never get. But for her, it was very healing, loving her children and trying to give them the life she didn't have and the sense of safety that she didn't have as a kid she and I talked explicitly about this. Sometimes when you're giving your child something that you yearned for, you're not just feeding them, you're healing you. And we talked about that numerous times. So it's obviously no person should ever beat another person in any situation, but it may be especially in a marriage or in a loving relationship. But it was complicated. And they'd
Well,
been
and she
together.
loved her
Yeah.
in-laws, and her in-laws really were kind of model loving parents that she didn't herself have. And I'm just curious if you've thought about it. Like, I think she really wants to paint Robbie as a Prince Charming who rescued her from this really just desperately terrible situation with Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. And I just wonder if there was just some embarrassment about all these facts becoming public. And in some ways, that story that not only that she was telling others, but that she told herself, she just couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I think to me, as we've said, she had tried to kill herself before. And she was still with Robbie then, and she was still with her kids then. But one really key fact that, again, I don't presume to put myself inside her head. I don't think anyone can know exactly why another person ends their own life. But I do know that the last time I spoke to her, the only thing she wanted to talk about was her kids. And why was that? Because, and I don't fully understand why this happened, but a judge in Australia put a restraining order on Virginia that forbid her from being in contact with her three kids, all of them teenagers at that point, in any way. She couldn't see them. She couldn't talk to them. She couldn't text them. She had already paid a fine for texting her daughter a song, not even words, not even a message, just a song. So she had been cut off from this family that she had created that had helped her heal. And being a mom was very important to her. And I think anyone who reads the book will read and see how much she adored her kids. So I know that the last time I talked to her, all she wanted was she wanted me to call her kids. She wanted me to find out how they were. And we talked about it and I said, I'm just worried if they're slapping you for sending a text of a song, they're going to slap you if you send your ghostwriter to call your kids. Like they're really going to slap you then. And I don't want them to do that. I don't really understand why you're being punished in this way, but it seems like they're pretty serious about it. But that was what was on her mind, was that she couldn't bear being separated from kids.
You haven't seen that protective order or what was, I mean, like, you haven't looked that up, like why they
I
ruled that way.
I don't know that the rationale for it is in the document. I do know there are some Australian journalists who are working on, it's hard to do it from this far away. You kind of have to go to the courthouse and get it. And I'm eager to know exactly what that rationale was. I mean, I think it was called a violent restraining order, which implies that Virginia was violent. And again, Virginia was I'm not quite sure, but maybe 5'5". She's not a big person. And she had a broken neck. I mean, she was not a person who could do a lot of damage, in my opinion, again. And I know how much she loved her kids. So I just don't understand why anyone would rule that way. But I don't know what was alleged.
Amy Wallace, thank you so much for being on the show today. I'd like to end by having you read the last paragraph of the book. In fact, I think it's long, but let's do the whole last paragraph.
Okay. So this is how the book ends. If you've read this far, I hope my story has moved you to seek ways to free yourself from a bad situation, say, to stand up for someone else in need, or to simply reframe how you judge victims of sexual abuse. Each one of us can make positive change. I truly believe that. I hope for a world in which predators are punished, not protected. Victims are treated with compassion, not shamed, and powerful people face the same consequences as anyone else. I yearn, too, for a world in which perpetrators face more shame than their victims do, and where anyone who's been trafficked can confront their abusers when they are ready, no matter how much time has passed. We don't live in this world yet. I mean, seriously, where are those videotapes the FBI confiscated from Epstein's houses? And why haven't they led to the prosecution of any more abusers? But I believe we could someday. Imagining it is the first step. In my mind, I hold a picture of a girl reaching out for help and easily finding it. I picture a woman, too, who, having come to terms with her childhood pain, feels that it's within her power to take action against those who hurt her. If this book moves us even an inch closer to a reality like that, if it helps just one person, I will have achieved my goal.
Thank you so much. Was there anything that I didn't ask about today that you wanted to say?
I don't think so. I'm very glad that you're working on this, and it sounds like it's an uphill battle, but it's important.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
I'd like to end today's show by reminding you of some remarkable context. It seems like ancient history, but it was just last summer that U.S. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson adjourned the House of Representatives to avoid a vote releasing the Epstein files. This led to a shutdown of legislative business that stretched to almost 8 weeks, ending only in early November 2025. It was during that hiatus that Nobody's Girl was released, and it unquestionably played a role in the mounting pressure campaign that resulted in an almost unanimous vote to release the Epstein files once Congress resumed. Virginia's brother, Sky, was front and center in that campaign to release the Epstein files. Here is an excerpt of him, Sky Roberts, speaking at a DC rally with other Epstein survivors in September 2025.
Let's be clear. This is not a political issue. This is not about left or right. This is about humanity. This is about doing what's right. And this is about ensuring that the future we leave behind isn't one where the powerful can hide behind their wealth, their influence, and their money to evade justice. Our plea to you, whether you're a dad, a mom, a brother, or a sister, look your young ones in the face. Look them in the eye and tell them you didn't stand against the very people who raped, molested, and preyed upon children and young women. Tell them you are willing to negotiate a deal. Money should never be what makes something right or wrong. If you vote no, your stance will be clear. You will be choosing to stand on the side of the rich and powerful, allowing money to buy your way out of the consequence. But here's my one ask. Look these survivors in the eye and tell them why. Then, look the people of the United States in the eye and tell them why. And then, when you're alone, look yourself in the mirror and ask yourself why. Virginia said it best, and I quote, "I have physical and mental scars that will never heal. I have memories that will never go away. They say time can heal, but this won't. Not until the justice system makes an example out of these people with so-called privileges. I just call it money. The only time I can begin to heal is when their freedom is taken from them, just like they did to me, and literally thousands of other victims. The survivors of this horrific abuse are watching. The American people are watching. And history is watching. Which side will you be on?
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklag.gov or call 907-465-4940.